Avi Abelo with 12 Tribe Films with Dumisani Washington. You are in Texas, if I'm not mistaken, Dumisani, right now?
I'm in Texas right now, San Antonio, Texas, the headquarters of Christians United for Israel and Cornerstone Church, Pastor John Hagee.
It is a pleasure meeting you, Dumisani. As I've understood it, you are the Diversity Outreach Director for CUFI, Christians United for Israel. You're also an author of a book, which I hope to hear more about later,
Sure.
Zionism in the Black Church, if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned.
Yes,
And please tell me, who are you and why are you doing what you're doing with regards to Zionism and the black community in America?
well, I am a Christian pastor. My roots begin in the southern United States. My parents were both born in the segregated South in Little Rock, Arkansas. I mentioned this in my book as well. And I was brought up in the black church tradition of Zionism, meaning that much of our experience, teaching, preaching, music, all of those things were always so identified with the Jewish people. It even in terms of our history and folklore, the greatest abolitionist that ever lived, Harriet Tubman, her nickname is Moses. And it's one of many, many, many examples of a lot of identification with African Americans when it came to scripture and when it came to, again, the Jewish people. So that was my upbringing. Over the years, I also, with my parents, we talked a lot about African American heritage. I had lots of conversations about the civil rights movements and those types of things. I was born in the late 60s, and so I was not old enough to have experienced things, obviously the 50s and 60s in terms of civil rights. My parents did and talked to me a lot about it. Being from Little Rock, Arkansas, we talked about Central High School and the Little Rock Nine and those types of things and some landmark cases and situations there. And we talked a lot about those things. So for me, growing up that way, and then also later on, really wanting to know more about the Hebrew roots of my faith as a Christian and everything, just got fascinated with that. And then that kind of morphed into studying about the Jewish diaspora. I was fascinated by the Jews of Ethiopia and India and Burma and all of that. And so it just became studies of mine, things that I would just do through the years and not really connecting these strands together for any reason in my mind. And then as older, hearing about and seeing particularly how Israel would be attacked and maligned, particularly with those words like apartheid and Jim Crow, and knowing full well my history and what that actually meant, I took great offense to that. And there was a great deal of passion in me to set that record straight. So all that studying over the years and all the upbringing in church, they just kind of converged into this very natural, organic Zionist movement in me that had a real strong African-American perspective to it. So that's kind of a short version of how that kind of came into being.
First of all, I want to say thank you. I'm a true believer that today people who have enough patience and knowledge to understand what's going on in the world, what's going on with Israel, the Middle East, any one of them, if they stand by Israel based on what they learn, they're not just standing up for Israel and the Jewish people, but they're really standing up for true Bible values in general, and for humanity. So I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you, not just as a Jew, as an Israeli, but as someone as part of this world and really taking that stand. And I guess the follow-up question I'd like to have is, one, you're obviously committed to Israel. You're obviously very committed to your Christian community and the black Christian community. With all of the issues you could be involved in, you've decided to very much focus on Israel. So I'm just interested, why with everything you could have focused on, are you focusing most of your time, I'm sure not all of it, but most of your time on this diversity outreach to the black community for Zionism and educating about Israel today?
I think, Avi, there's probably a dual answer to that. The first one, again, I have to use the word organic again. It was just a natural outgrowth of, I've always been fairly outspoken when it comes to whether it's ethnic issues or civil rights issues, that type of thing. And that was very much from my family. My mom in particular, she passed away in 2002. Very, very, very outspoken, very, very vocal And she would say things to me when I was a little kid that I didn't really get at the time. I really couldn't appreciate at the time. Now that I'm in my late 40s, I get it more. And so that was just kind of a natural thing. And so I would speak out on different issues, wrote op-eds in my hometown in Stockton, California, and everything about things that were important to me, important to not just in terms of the Black community, but how it affected the broader community. The other part of that would be, I'd have to be honest, in terms of had to do with my faith. It was a real strong calling of mine. Really felt this very, very much of a God connection in terms of being vocal where Israel is concerned, not just obviously as a pastor, but also someone who defends human rights and those types of things. And so my one and only trip to Israel was in 2012, Hanukkah 2012. Wow. I went with a Black pastors group from CUFI, as a matter of fact. That was my first time going after having studied and watched and followed all those things. And I can honestly say that, obviously, first of all, just it was an amazing time going to different parts of the land. But it was also very, very poignant time for me spiritually, that all those connections, all those different strands kind of came together there at the Kotel. As I'm just kind of praying, and it's a very, very humbling, as you already know, all those things from my upbringing, my parents, Little Rock, Arkansas, California, it's just like all these things kind of came together. And I had a really, really strong sense that when I got back to the States, I needed to officially and vocally advocate for the Jewish state. And one of the things that Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel does, it also advocates very strongly for strong Israel-Africa alliances, going back and doing the research. Things were fascinating over periods of time, but just seeing that as Israel, for example, gains independence from Great Britain in 1948, and 9 years later, so does Ghana, and followed by Kenya and Senegal, and on and on. And one of the things that each of these nations has in common is that one of the first nations with which they established diplomatic ties, Israel, and has been from that time. People not knowing that. Golda Meir being called the Mother of Africa by Julius Nyerere. Those types of things, and why that was the case. Even now, as we see right now with Nigeria and its vicious fight with Boko Haram, and how Israel has been consistently there helping. President Goodluck Jonathan goes to Israel a few months ago with a delegation of some, 80 different people, and he very vocally reaffirms his ties with Israel, and he asks again for their help in terms of counterterrorism, those types of things. Those things resonate with me, and those things that many people casually may not know, and our organization puts those things out there to describe, not just in terms of what was the past, but how that's shaping the present day right now.
I see, actually, lately you've been writing a lot, especially on Twitter, about what's going on in Nigeria. Can you expand upon that, since you just raised that? That's a very important thing.
I'll do it carefully. I'm very passionate, and like anything else, it's my strength and my weakness. So I'm measuring my words. I'm very, very kind of preoccupied, if you will, with the goings on. Again, with my background, having followed it in Nigerian history, that type of thing, to see that Boko Haram has, we estimate now, with some friends that I confer with in Nigeria, is in control of some 70% of the northeastern part of the country. And Nigeria, the most populous nation in Africa. To see this fight, which is a very winnable fight, that's why I say my passion. Boko Haram back in 2012 spoke very blatantly about what it was going to do in wiping out the Christian population. And they are doing it pretty much unfettered. It is reaching the proportions, with all due respect to our other friends in Rwanda and Sudan, this is reaching those proportions. Thousands have been killed. Millions have been displaced. And there is their next election is February the 14th, and there are some people who are very knowledgeable who are predicting even more deaths. While Boko Haram, who very much sees itself as connected to ISIS and establishing the global caliphate, at least going from Syria all the way to West Africa. Nigeria gets it. They understand the fight that they're in, and they understand why Israel is such a close ally to them.
So that brings me to the next question, which really is that today there is a genocide taking place, not just in Nigeria, but across the Middle East, which is the Christian genocide. The Muslims are actually doing a Christian genocide in the Middle East.
Yes.
How how awake, how knowledgeable are Christians in America to what's going on? And I guess the follow-up question is, why the silence? I mean, love to hear from you. That's one of the questions we have in Israel when we're always deflecting. Why are you focusing on Israel? We're the ones we give human rights, equal rights to the Arabs. We're the ones who are always asking for peace. Why are you silent about the true genocide taking place, and instead of falling for the lies and propaganda about a genocide that the Jews are doing against the Arabs? The Arab population in Israel, the West Bank and Gaza continuously grows. It's impossible. There is no genocide. But there's a true
Absolutely.
Christian genocide. Why? It's hurtful and baffling to just hear nothing.
Yes. My friends and I, one of my good friends with CUFI, I have lots of friends in CUFI, but Victor Stursky and I talk about this often. He's the Eastern Region Coordinator for Christians United for Israel. And we talk about outrage and righteous indignation. So what you are articulating, Avi, we talk about often, and it actually is part of the fuel for what it is that we do. When it comes to advocating for the only viable democracy in the Middle East, there's so many roads that lead there. So in the terms of the Christian genocide, as you say, that's happening, and yes, within the history of the church, there has not been such a slaughtering of men and women who are Christians since the book of Acts versus Christians. This is unprecedented what's going on now. And so, unfortunately, and you're right, like any other issue here in the States, you have those three sides. You have people who are passionate on one side or the other, and then you have that huge apathetic or just unaware middle. And that's a lot of what we see. Where our passion and frustration boils over is what you're articulating there. Are Christians, for example, who are a small group, but we're monitoring it, we're seeing it grow slightly. Christians who would consider themselves anti-Zionist. They wouldn't say it that way. They'd call themselves pro-Palestinian, but it's the same thing. In terms of their approach is what I mean by that. And at the same time, that same group tend to all but ignore the slaughtering that's going on of Christians throughout the Middle East. And yes, it is baffling. So for you as a Jewish person, you're trying to wrap your brain around it. I'm a Christian, and we're trying to wrap our brains around it, just to let you know. This is something, so we speak passionately about it. I can tell you that as we're sharing these things with other pastors, as we're going across the country, whether it's on college campuses or in these churches, for example, oftentimes the people do not know, they're not aware. And once they become aware, they do want to become more involved. They may join CUFI, they may come to another event with CUFI, because again, like anything else, people are living their lives, they're doing their thing, and oftentimes they're concerned about, their mortgage, their car, or whatever. And oftentimes, we have to be stirred and shaken out of our routine to actually see, hey, this is what's going on. There are people, that are brothers and sisters in Christ, who are dying for their faith. And that obviously, that in and of itself is all-encompassing. But when you, as Christians, we add to the fact that the only place where Christians are free and are growing and thriving in the Middle East is Israel, the Jewish state of Israel. It makes our job that much more pertinent, but it also kind of brings it home even more so for Christians who aren't aware of either of those things. They may not be aware of the genocide that's happening, and they may not be aware on top of that Israel is the only safe haven there in the Middle East.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm going to pivot a second to asking you specifically, when you are doing your diversity outreach across America to Japan, what do you find touches people most that make them all of a sudden have that aha moment and start listening to what you're saying and believing, you know what, we really should be supporting Israel and more active in our own lives to assist Israel because it assists us? What touches upon people? I'm just interested to know.
So what I've seen, Avi, are two different ones. When I'm speaking with pastors and Christians, usually the aha moment is very much what we're talking about now. The plight of Christians throughout the Middle East and what Israel is doing to provide not just safe haven, but the only place where Christians, Jews, Muslims of all faiths, even of no faiths, can live and live in peace. Oftentimes Christians, the Christian community, if they're not aware of those issues that pertain to the Middle East or Israel, they're certainly not aware of what's going on with the Christians there. So that's usually the aha moment, particularly for Christian leaders, when it really hits them. In our scriptures in the New Testament, it says in Hebrews chapter 13 that we're supposed to remember those that are in chains as if we were chained ourselves. And it's an exhortation to totally empathize with Christians who are being persecuted and everything. So when we remind them of the scripture and then we show them, hey, this is what's going on right now, and this is what the Jewish state of Israel is doing to help us. I have Jewish and Israeli friends who've written more about Christian persecution than some of my Christian friends. So when we bring that up to them, that's the first thing. On the campuses, it's usually different, because usually the campus, it's usually a secular situation. So I'm not in the mode of the preaching or teaching, or although I'm always a pastor, I'm not always doing scripturally. But the aha moment that we're finding that's been very, very powerful for the young people on campuses is when we deal with Palestinian human rights. We go directly for the jugular, and we call out the hypocrisy and the arrogance of organizations like Students for Justice in Palestine, both their name and their faux mantra, if you will. And we talk about the honor killings. We talk about the human shields. We go through a litany of all of these things that if someone who's truly concerned with quote-unquote Palestinian human rights, and they're virtually silent on all those things, but they want to talk about the quote-unquote occupation. And oftentimes when the young people see that, they see the graphic, they see the articles written oftentimes by Arab journalists, it usually is an aha moment for them. I've had conversations with SJP members who don't know what's going on in Gaza or the West Bank in terms of how Fatah and Hamas are destroying their own people. And they're oftentimes incredulous. Oftentimes young people just kind of caught up in what they feel is a movement, and they want to come against what they feel is quote-unquote oppression. But when you begin to tell them things like the leader of Hamas is worth $2.6 billion, that Hamas is the second wealthiest terrorist organization on the planet after ISIS, their eyes oftentimes open up. They're realizing, gee, I see poverty in Gaza, but not for Hamas. I see poverty in the West Bank, but not for Fatah, that Mahmoud Abbas is reported to have anywhere be worth between 100 to $500 million, and that his predecessor died with billions. When they see that and they're really wanting to talk about social justice and change, oftentimes that's the aha moment for them. They leave asking their own people questions like, gee, you know what, and you know what, that's not our goal. If they come in anti-Israel, we know that they're not going to leave pro-Israel after our lecture, but they are going to leave with questions. They're going to leave with questions like, hey, you know what, wait a minute, what about the fact that honor killings are up over 200% in the last 2 years? What is going on? How are we up for women's rights, and we're coming against Israel, where they're actually being killed over here with impunity in the Palestinian territories? That's usually the aha moment for them.
Right. You actually raised a number of great points in terms of explaining the true situation, both in the church and the college campuses. I'm a huge believer in the slogan, and you are more than welcome to use it. I don't think I created it. A true liberal supports Israel. All of those true liberal values for equal rights, human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc., that's what Israel stands for. Whereas all the other countries in the Middle East, that the progressives have hijacked as part of their progressive agenda, go against all of the values they pretend to stand up for. The biggest hypocrisy. But I'm also glad that you raised Golda Meir in terms of everything she did. She was the real Israeli pioneer in helping develop African countries, and as well as the Jews who were very involved in the civil rights movement in America. Which brings me to your Martin Luther King video you just made. Can you tell some people about that video and why you made that? You just promoted that on Martin Luther King Day last week.
Absolutely. Well, actually, we made it last year, but we re-released it again, I should say, obviously during his celebration and everything. But the reason that we made it, first and foremost, was to set the record straight. When we deal with, unfortunately, anti-Zionist movements, anti-Zionist ideology, one of the most favorite things, I can say that way, that anti-Zionists like to do is pilfer legacy. This is what we talk about a great deal with Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel, and also with CUFI. And Dr. King's words are oftentimes used in a very, very twisted way. One of his most famous quotes is from letters from a Birmingham jail: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And anti-Zionist groups love using that quote and firing it away at Israel. And so what we've got to do is set the record straight in terms of Dr. King, his legacy as well. He was a staunch supporter of Israel and loyal friend to the Jewish people. And we also let them know, as we say in the video, that that does not mean he was dismissive to the Arab concerns. It just means that Dr. King had the wisdom to be able to separate the two. And so he spoke very, very vehemently and passionately. And those who are the critics of Israel, if you will, or the anti-Zionists, once again, they love to revel. It's amazing. They like to say that he made all those positive statements about Israel before the 1967 war, yada yada. And not only is that not true, it was almost a full year after the 1967 war when he was the most passionate. And not only that, as you probably are aware, after the 67 war, when much of the international community was condemning Israel, Dr. King's words then resonate even stronger at that point. The Arab League comes together in September of 67. They give the three no's: no peace, no negotiations, no recognitions with Israel. Dr. King is unfazed by that. You have a militant black civil rights movement that's growing during his time. You have upheaval because of the Vietnam War, the disproportionate number of African-American young men that are dying in that war. And all these things, people are using these things, just like today, to come against the state of Israel. And Dr. King is not having any of it. He's very aware. He's very conscious of what's happening. He and his colleagues continue to make statements speaking both to the black community and to the world in general that Israel is a democracy. He said it's an oasis of brotherhood and freedom. He chose his words carefully. And when he called it an oasis and he called it things like an outpost, that means that it was surrounded by things that were unlike it. He recognized the fact that Israel was a democracy surrounded by despotism. And that's who Dr. King was. And we were trying to set that record straight, that not only did he support Israel, he knew exactly what he was doing. And much like today, Israel was being denounced and delegitimized.
Well, Pastor Dumisani, our time is running out, and I just wanted to thank you for your time. Thank you for your continued work and support, which again I believe is not just about standing up for Israel, but it's really about humanity and bringing the world to a better place. And I hope that upon your next and soon visit to Israel, it will be a pleasure to meet you.
I'd love to. I will be there in February. I don't know how much free time I'll have. I'll have another delegation that I'm with and everything, but I plan on being there pretty often, as much as I can, so it'll be a pleasure to meet you there.
We're in Jerusalem and in the Judean hills of Gush Etzion. If it's on your itinerary, it would be a pleasure. And may God give you the continued strength to do the wonderful and fabulous and important work you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I really do.